Shabbat Shalom. The story is told of Saul and Bernie, two old men sitting next to each other on a park bench reading the newspaper. Of course, Saul is pouring through whatever his local Jewish news was, reading every word. When he takes a break and looks up for a moment, and there next to him he sees his friend Bernie. And he glances over to see what newspaper Bernie is reading. When he looks a little closer, he sees Bernie is reading one of the leading anti-Semitic newspapers. Saul says, Bernie, what are you doing? How can you be reading an anti-Semitic newspaper just like that? Bernie says, Saul, are you kidding me? When I read your newspaper, when I read the Jewish news of your town, what do I read? Jews are assimilating. People are attacking the state of Israel. It's so tough to be a Jew. When I read my newspaper, this anti-Semitic newspaper, what do I read? The Jews own all the banks. The Jews own the media. The Jews own everything. It's tough to be a Jew. It is especially tough to be a Jew now. In these short weeks after the brouhaha with regard to Judge Kavanaugh, there are flyers going around in various spots in the country, blaming who for the difficulty of Judge Kavanaugh's nomination and confirmation? Blaming the Jews. And of course, here at home, we have the anti-Semitism that has been thinly veiled as BDS and anti-Zionism taking place in Ann Arbor on the University of Michigan, with professors denying students letters of recommendation to go study at Israeli universities, with one professor hiding behind his proclamation of freedom of speech that he can, with impunity, juxtapose images of Adolf Hitler and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's tough to be a Jew. We know that often how a country treats the Jewish people is a litmus test for how it treats all of those who may be minorities, who may be different, who may be considered the other. And if that's the case, if the Jewish people is a litmus test for how we're treating the other, this country is heading in the wrong direction. Now we know that in 21st century America, the Jews are not the canary in the coal mine that they have been for the last many centuries around the world. Right? For the last many centuries around the world, the Jews have been the canary in the coal mine, where if you want to see a nation start to turn upon itself, if you want to see a case of us versus them going and growing to the extreme, you'll look at how a nation treats the Jewish community. In the United States of America in 2018, almost now 2019, the Jews, however, are not the canaries in the coal mine. Rather, we look upon how a nation treats, how our nation treats members of the LGBTQ plus community. We look at how our nation, perhaps other nations, treat immigrants, people new to this country. That now is the litmus test for the direction a country is going. And it makes me nervous. It scares me. Maybe in our country, the Jews are not the first to suffer. But you can be sure if there are those who are suffering, the Jews will be the next ones. And so it is with that in mind that we turn now to the book of Genesis. And I spoke last week about Cain and Abel and how about the beginning of this idea of competition, of fighting over power. This idea of us versus them. And how that concept of us versus them is really built into the fabric of humanity. But what it means to be a human. And our need to, Shabbat Shalom, our need to overcome that. So here we are now in the second Torah portion of the book of Genesis, Parashat Noach. And many of us look upon Noach and feel as if it's almost a children's story. I had the pleasure of doing Shabbat yesterday morning with the Hillel ECC, and of course, we sang about Noah and the animal coming in twosie by twosies, about how it rained and poured for 40 daisies. Right? And how the animals went in by twosies but came out by threesies. And we treat it as a children's story that the song is. There are others who look to this week's Torah portion, Parashat Noach, and see it as simply an explanation for the beginning of the world. After all, what happened and what continues to happen with the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, one of the cradles of civilization, they flood. And perhaps it's simply an explanation of how the world came to be, borrowed maybe even from other civilizations. And that's the beginning of our Torah portion this week, Parashat Noach. And if we turn to the end of our Torah portion, we have the Tower of Babel story. Confusing story. And I'll invite you to turn with me in your Eitz Chaim Chumashim to chapter 11. I'm on page 58. In our Eitz Chaim Chumashim, page 58. And it says on page 58 here, the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis, Vayihi chol haaretz ha'echad, udvarim achadim. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, the Torah tells us they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, Hava nilbana levanim, come let us make bricks and burn them hard. Bricks serve them as stone, and bitumen serve them as mortar. And they said, come let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world. The Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built. And the Lord said, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they've begun to act, then nothing they may propose will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Of course, we know what happens next. God comes down and ultimately destroys the Tower of Babel. He says that each and every person shall have a different language, and he scatters them throughout the world. It seems that the Tower of Babel is one of the great sins of early humankind, just as Cain killed Abel. Just as the world was filled with violence, and so God flooded it, saved Noah and his wife and his family. Here we have the Tower of Babel. What is the great sin that God was so angry that he would destroy this tower and confound their languages? What could be so wrong with building a tower and everybody able to communicate with each other? Now, earlier this morning, Aaron gave us one of the classic midrashim that comes to explain why the tower was so bad. And as Aaron reminded us, it seems as if when they were building the tower, they cared more about the construction than about the people who were building it. When a brick would fall from the tower and smash to the ground, that they would mourn and lament the loss of that money. But when a person working on the tower would fall and die, that they could care less about. So perhaps, as our classical commentators and the Midrashim come to teach, the Tower of Babel is really a case study in anti-civilization, a case study in what happens when people put things above other people. But I've been reading, and I mentioned last week, this book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks called Not in God's Name. One of the most profound books that I've read in recent years, and I recommend it to everybody. And while Rabbi Sacks references this midrash, after all, it's a classic midrash of our people, he comes to teach that by and large, that's a myopic view of the story in our Torah portion. But rather, in order to fully understand the book of Genesis, in order to fully understand Parashat Noach, we have to juxtapose and compare the early story of Noah with this Tower of Babel story. And if we look at what happens with Noah, why does God get so angry with the world that he wants to ultimately flood it and thus destroy it? It says in our Torah that the world was filled with Hamas, with violence. That the world was filled with anarchy. that people did whatever they felt was right. And so as a result of them doing whatever they felt was right, they began to commit violence because they knew what they did was right and what the other did had to be wrong. They knew that what they wanted what was best, and that what the other wanted must have been less than. And so the world evolved in a case of us versus them, of violence, of one human being against another human being, or small groups against other small groups. Because that's what we humans do. We look at each other as us versus them, and we engage in violence. Now, what is the opposite side of the pendulum from each and every individual, each and every group, seeing it as me versus you, as us versus them? The opposite is what happens with the Tower of Babel. When you have an individual or an empire that come in, that try to put one voice, one perspective, one idea over everybody. Rabbi Sachs teaches that the great sin of the Tower of Babel had nothing to do with the fact that they were trying to build a large building. The great evil of the Tower of Babel was that there was an individual, or perhaps a nation. Perhaps it was the Babylonians. Perhaps it was the Egyptians that came to try to impose their will upon everyone. Indeed, if we look at the Hebrew that we just read, the Hebrew of "come, let us build," lest, hava and pen in the Hebrew, "come, let us," lest, appears only twice in the entire Torah. Once with regard to the Tower of Babel, and again in the book of Exodus, when the Egyptians, when Pharaoh says, "Come, let us enslave these people, lest they rise up against us." And so perhaps this story of Parashat Noach is really a polemic against what happens when we have small groups of people forming us against them, or a large nation that seeks to impose its will on everybody. And if we look at our world, Rabbi Sachs teaches, this is the pendulum swing that we see. After all, we look at what the Babylonians did, the Egyptians, at the Greeks, at the Romans, as how they tried to rule the world and force their religion, their politics, their beliefs upon everybody. We saw it, frankly, 1,000 years ago, as the Muslims tried to do the same thing to Europe, and the Christians tried to do the same thing in Europe. We've seen it in our own time in the 20th century, as under the names of communism or socialism or fascism, individuals, nations have come forward to try to impose their will upon the whole world. And as Rabbi Sachs teaches us, at the end of the 20th century, an amazing thing happened. At the end of the 20th century, something we'd never seen happen before happened. The isms were destroyed. The great nations or leaders who sought to impose their will upon the whole world lost. And what was left in its place was only one ism: liberalism. This idea of freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, where each and every person can do whatever he or she so pleases. Perhaps not unlike how the story of Noah begins. And so now here we are in the beginning decades of the 21st century, and we see a reaction to that liberalism. We see the pendulum swinging once again as those people who like security, who like structure, who like to believe in us versus them, and I'm right and you're wrong, are once again starting to take over. They're the ones who are gaining power. When we start to impose our will on others, perhaps like the LGBTQ+ community, perhaps like immigrants, foreigners, those who look or seem different than us, the pendulum is again swinging in the opposite direction, toward the Tower of Babel. And so we come now with that in mind, with Parashat Noach so real in our own day, to the very end of the Torah portion that Aaron chanted so beautifully just a few minutes ago. And how does our Torah portion end this morning? How does Parashat Noach come to a conclusion? The birth of a man named Avram. The birth of the person who will begin the Jewish people. How does our Torah portion end? Not with the pendulum once again swinging this way or that way, but perhaps a middle road. Because as our Torah readings will continue over the rest of the year, we'll come to learn about a man and a people who are commanded to care for their own and build their own nation in a particularistic way. We see a commandment to build a nation and a people that have its own relationship with God, that has its own language, its own expression, its own land. But at the same time, those same people are commanded not to hate, not to war, not to reject others entirely. A nation that's commanded to love. To love God, to love our neighbor, to love the stranger among us. The antidote to the great poles of this world, the antidote to the evil that exists around us, is Torah. As our rabbis teach, Marbeh Torah, Marbeh Shalom, the more Torah there is in the world, the more peace there is. And so when God sees humankind as swinging constantly between this pole of small groups saying us against them and large nations saying it doesn't need to be us against them when I can impose my will upon the entire world, God gives us Judaism. God gives us the Jewish people. That says, go out and teach the world how you can celebrate your own identity, how you can embrace your own identity, how you can live as a strong Jewish people committed to each other, seeking to marry each other, seeking to perpetuate a land and a state dedicated to your people, while at the same time loving the other, while at the same time embracing the neighbor, loving the stranger. This Shabbat of Parashat Noach, we are commanded. Let us love each other while still embracing the Jewish people. Let us find a middle road between what was and between where we are going, that we can be strong in our identity as a people, as a country, while still loving and embracing those who may see the world differently from us. On this Shabbat of Parashat Noach, may God grant us a rainbow in the sky, that we should remember God's blessings upon us, and that God loves the whole world as well. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and let us say together.